Welcome, and thank you for being with us today. I'm Lindsay Vidaniaks, and I'm Executive Director of the Headache and Migraine Policy Forum, a nonprofit stakeholder coalition of members, including clinician and patient advocates, as well as veterans groups, women's health groups, and others disproportionately affected by migraine disease and headache disorders. For the last 5 years during Headache on the Hill, we have convened policymakers, clinician patient advocates, and Capitol Hill staff to highlight an issue of importance to the community. And this year's topic couldn't be more important. How are we going to make sure our veterans and first responders living with chronic headache disorders and migraine disease can receive adequate care and treatment? We have a pretty dynamic program this year. We will kick it off with a keynote address from Congressman Mark Takano, who is chairman of the House Committee on Veterans Affairs. And then we will feature remarks from special guest speaker Jon Stewart, national advocate for service personnel with toxic exposures and former host of The Daily Show. And then we will move to our panel moderated by Paula Dumas, president of the World Health Education Foundation, and feature speakers John Fiel, who is a 9/11 first responder, activist, and Army veteran, Joe McKay, who is with the New York Fire Department on 9/11 and was a first responder and lives with cluster headache disease. And then finally, Dr. Jason Seco, who is the national clinical lead for the VA Headache Centers of Excellence. And then we will move to the call to action by Dr. Robert Shapiro, who is professor of neurology at the University of Vermont Medical Center and founder of the Alliance for Headache Disorders Advocacy, which is co-hosting our program today. And then I will close it out with a few final remarks. But before we get started, I just really want to thank the Alliance for Headache Disorders Advocacy for helping to organize Headache on the Hill and speak to all the advocates who are working with their members of Congress today. You know, advocacy can be challenging even in perfect health. So what you do today, while it can be exhausting and trying, it is most definitely brave. So thank you for being here. And now I'm pleased to introduce our keynote speaker, Congressman Mark Takano, who represents the 41st District in California and serves as chairman of the House Committee on Veterans Affairs. For more than 20 years, Chairman Takano has worked to improve the lives of Riverside County residents, both as an elected official and as a former teacher at Rialto High School. Besides his chairmanship, he also serves on the House Education and Labor Committee. Chairman Takano graduated from Harvard College in 1983 and was elected to Congress as the first openly gay person of color. The congressman cares deeply about our veterans. Members of his family served in the revered 442nd Infantry in World War II, an infantry regiment known for being composed almost entirely of second-generation American soldiers of Japanese ancestry. His grandparents, along with his parents, were removed from their respective homes and sent to Japanese American internment camps during World War II. After the war, they settled in Riverside County to rebuild their lives. Thank you, Chairman Takano, for being here today.
Well, thank you so much for that kind introduction. First off, I appreciate being invited today to speak at your forum. And as we continue to combat the COVID-19 pandemic, I'm grateful that I can join you virtually and thank you for your advocacy on behalf of our nation's veterans. For me, this issue is personal. I experience migraines myself from time to time and know how debilitating they can be. And I know that depending on which health plan or which health plan you may not be on, that medications can be really, really expensive. That's why I'm particularly glad to see that Dr. Jason Seco, the National Clinical Lead for VA's Headache Centers of Excellence, will be on a panel later this afternoon. VA is doing tremendous work to make sure that it is prepared to care for the unique needs of our veteran population. And I'm glad that you will be able to hear from him. Now, as chairman of the House Committee on Veterans Affairs, I hear from many veterans struggling with the effects of toxic exposure following their service to our country. Every day, More and more veterans speak out about airborne hazards from burn pits and other sources that they were exposed to. And we're still learning about the long-term effects of that exposure. Right now, over 230,000 veterans have joined VA's Airborne Hazards and Open Burn Pit Registry, which documents self-reported health impacts. While much is still unknown, veterans exposed to burn pits report unexplained chronic illnesses, cancers, and respiratory conditions. And for many veterans, that means living with debilitating headaches and chronic migraines. Currently, over 1 million veterans seeking care at VA are diagnosed with a headache disorder, and 22% of veterans deployed with duties involving burn pits report functional limitations due to migraines. We have a responsibility to care for all those who have borne the battle, and we cannot leave these veterans behind. I know that ensuring equitable access to specialized healthcare for chronic headache disorders is a top priority for you. This is crucial. Congress provided funding in 2018 to establish VA Headache Centers of Excellence for specialized care and research, and I hope Dr. Seco will speak to how the COVID-19 pandemic affected VA's capacity to use this funding. VA providers in these centers provide high-quality healthcare. They capitalize on the integrated interdisciplinary team care for which VA is recognized and understand the complexities of treating veterans, including the effects of toxic exposure. I've made addressing toxic exposure a top priority of this Congress, and I'm committed to moving forward comprehensive legislation to ensure all of our veterans exposed to toxic substances during their service can access the care and benefits they've earned, regardless of where or when they served. Last Congress, I led the effort to finally pass the Blue Water Navy Vietnam Veterans Act. This was a momentous step to grant benefits to veterans who served off the coast of Vietnam and were exposed to Agent Orange. But it took more than 40 years to provide these veterans relief. We cannot let that happen again. Along with our Subcommittee on Disability and Memorial Affairs Chair, Elaine Luria, our committee is determined to find a solution so veterans exposed to toxic substances can equitably access the care they need and ultimately create a fair process for VA to decide future presumptions. Now, the burden of proof shouldn't be on our veterans, and there's no reason that they or their survivors should have to fight VA for the care and benefits they've earned. Now, I've heard some veterans who haven't even filed a claim because of the high denial rate. And those that worry if adding their name to the burn pit registry is worth it. It is worth it. Veterans, please add your name and please keep telling your stories. We need to recognize toxic exposure as a cost of war. And that's why we'll be focusing on it again in this Congress. If America is willing to send our service members into harm's way to defend our democracy, then she must be willing to take care of all those who have borne the battle. Rest assured, I will not forget our veterans living with chronic headache disorders. Thank you for your advocacy and your service for our veterans.
Thank you, Chairman Chicano. We are so proud of everything you're doing for the veterans community, and we're really looking forward to seeing what Congress does on this issue. We appreciate your leadership. And now I would like to introduce our guest speaker, who has truly dedicated a second career to helping people get better, whether that's veterans and first responders who need access to treatment and healthcare, or policymakers who need to understand how to do the right thing. We are so excited to welcome John Stewart, National Advocate for Service Personnel with Toxic Exposures and former host of The Daily Show. Thank you for being here, John.
Thank you very much for having me. And I want to thank everybody for being here today and all the hard work that they are doing on behalf of those suffering from these debilitating headaches and toxic exposures. I first want to apologize. Lindsay, your background is tremendous. The fireplace, Chairman Takano has a library of books, and I am in my children's old playroom in front of their chalkboard. So I apologize to you for the WWE scrawlings that my son Nate has drawn behind me and my daughter. They kicked me out of my office, and now I have their old office. It's not a pleasant thing. I want to be frank with you guys and say this. This seminar should not exist, shouldn't have to exist. You shouldn't have to be here. You shouldn't have to advocate. This should have been done years ago. And it's very important to view the parameters around toxic exposure for veterans and first responders and what it means to the VA. So first and foremost, the VA should be an advocate for veterans' health care and not an obstacle to veterans' health care. It shouldn't function like an insurance company where you are forced to be your own lawyer, advocate, and doctor to make your case to the VA that your health conditions are tied to your service. That's first and foremost. What we saw in the 9/11 community is a very similar kind of narrative, which is the first thing they tell you is, you're not actually sick. This is perhaps anxiety, perhaps it's in your head, perhaps it's just a function of trauma. There are not actually health detriments going on in your life. Ultimately, they come around when it becomes undeniable and they suggest, okay, well, you're sick, there's something wrong here, but it doesn't have anything to do with your service and it can't be tied then to the benefits. And they use a process of scrutiny to delay and to deny, so that individuals who fought for our country, who served admirably, have not only the burden of their health condition, not only the burden of their loss of wages, not only the burden of caregiving amongst their family members, they now have the burden to be their own advocates, to go down and have to try and gain a foothold in a bureaucratic Washington system that doesn't seem designed to help, but to hold you at bay. We welcome all congressional help in terms of getting legislation passed, but the important thing is this. This is an eminently solvable problem. You know, the health condition of cluster headaches and migraines and those things is really complex, and that's going to take all the best scientific minds and all the best doctors to find ways to bring comfort and healing to those who suffer from this incredibly debilitating condition. But what is eminently fixable is the process by which you have to go and access that help and access that health care. Right now, the burden of proof is on you. And I'm going to give you the two obstacles that they always hold in front of any positive legislation that can solve this issue. The first is science. Well, geez, my gosh, the science, we don't know. It isn't there. The NAS released a study that says we can't draw a direct correlation between toxic exposures of burn pits and some of these health conditions. But if you burrow yourself down in the report, what you learn is what they're saying is we actually have insufficient data, and that data is provided by the Department of Defense and the VA. So veterans are being penalized for insufficient data by the very organizations that they have to lobby to get further health care. I think we see that the issue here, you would not let an insurance company control the studies that link health conditions to certain things. And the second thing is this. Come on, people. We have no links to the toxic exposure of burn pits to health conditions. Burn pits were outlawed in the United States in 1971. If you want to tell me that we don't know that the burn pits and the toxic exposures cause these health conditions, I would challenge any of our congresspeople to allow us to dig a 100-yard wide pit in the middle of their constituents and burn all of their constituents' waste, whether it be hazardous materials or human waste, or in the case of the burn pits in Iraq and Afghanistan, munitions. I mean, literally, the smoking gun in this case are smoking guns. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And how did they keep those things burning? Jet propulsion fuel, or JPBs. You know, the very same toxic mix that ignited ground zero and caused all the health effects for our 9/11 first responders. This is a no-brainer. There's no question that these toxic exposures are linked to it. And what's going to happen is we're going to go to Congress. We're introducing a bill called the Warfighters Bill. It's going to be introduced either Thursday or Friday. We're going to hold a press conference about it on April 13th down at the Capitol. And it does the one thing that we need to do for veterans to get them help, and that is presumption. There are a lot of bills circling around this issue right now, and all of them will do some good. But they mostly do a bit of good. And they talk about, and we're going to do some more studies, and we're going to gather more registries, and this is all delaying and denying what is the ultimate obstacle to this, and that is money. Do not allow them to use the lack of what they consider to be scientific proof as a way to having to pay for the health care and disability that you all earned and need. This has to get done, and we believe that the Warfighters Bill is the best solution to this issue. It presumes that if you were there, you were exposed. And if you were exposed, here is the list of health conditions that we know are caused by exposure to particulate burns. Man, there are burn pit sites in America that when they close down are declared Superfund sites. So don't play us with this idea that we just can't connect it to it. You know, we know smoking causes lung cancer, but if you force an individual to prove that their lung cancer was definitively caused by cigarettes, it's an impossibility. So let's not force our veterans and their families to do that. Presumption is the only solution to this eminently solvable problem. And I don't want to hear about money, because when the Department of Defense has a $750 to $800 billion budget, and $400 billion of those dollars go to defense contractors, the very same contractors that ran the burn pits in Iraq and Afghanistan, who can't be sued because they have sovereign immunity, yet made billions of dollars profiting while actually causing the health consequences for our veterans, unacceptable. You have the money, you've just allocated it to things like the F-35. $1.7 trillion of nothing. So I thank you all so much for your advocacy, for your service, for all the things that you do, for your resilience in getting through what I can't even imagine are tremendous health consequences while still trying to care for your families and do the right thing by your communities. So we have done a terrible, terrible disservice to you. And it is a moral imperative that we pass a bill on presumption as soon as possible, not 5 years down the road. The urgency is now. People will continue to die and suffer needlessly if we don't get this done. And all that I ask of you is, when the time comes and we need to activate you, to place pressure on our congressional representatives to understand the gravity of this issue, I would love to be able to have us call on you. So thank you all so very much, and continued success in fighting this.
Thank you, John. And, you know, this isn't a needle moving exercise. There's going to be action this year, and we're just proud to stand with all of the advocates who, when they wake up each morning, they don't know if they're going to be disabled by an attack. So it is a particularly brutal
Yeah.
exercise for them, but it just shows the passion and how much they care about the issue. So
And they
we thank
shouldn't have to be forced to fight for things that they've already earned. This should have been done 10 years ago, and we're going to make sure that it's done soon.
We are so proud to have you on our side, and thank you for taking your time today. You're welcome to stay if you'd like to. I know
Absolutely.
we have a lot of great information to get through with our panel, so I'm going to turn it over to Paula Dumas, who is our moderator. She is founder and president of the World Health Education Foundation, and she'll be moderating our panel of heroes today. Paula is an internationally recognized migraine advocate and former Headache on the Hill advocate who also manages the Migraine World Summit currently underway. Paula, you have just an incredible panel today.
Thank you, Lindsay, and I am honored to lead this panel and this discussion, and to HMPF and to ATA for hosting the event, and to Chairman Takano and Jon Stewart for bringing their incredible influence to this topic. So, as I said, I'm honored to moderate what promises to be a fascinating discussion with some important news today. So let me start by taking a minute to introduce each of these heroes. John Feal is a veteran of the U.S. Army's Airborne Division and a 9/11 first responder. And on September 12, 2001, John and his team of construction demolition experts were called to Ground Zero in Lower Manhattan to aid in the cleanup and recovery mission. And while supervising his team, roughly 8,000 pounds of steel came loose from the huge pile and crushed his left foot, resulting in a partial amputation and lasting pain. But he turned his pain into national healing by founding the Feel Good Foundation, an organization ensuring that no first responder would be left behind, which is also the name of a forthcoming documentary. Stay tuned for that. Since then, Mr. Feal has worked tirelessly with Jon Stewart and other national advocates to help secure lasting funding for the 9/11 Victim Compensation Fund. And in addition, he also fights to get better care for veterans with health conditions arising from burn pits during the Iraq and Afghan conflicts. So we're excited to hear from him. Joe McKay is a 9/11 first responder and a retired member of the FDNY. He was assigned to Engine Company 201 in Sunset Park, Brooklyn at age 29 in 1998. But after the events of September 11th, Mr. McKay turned his attention to advocacy, participating in the 9/11 first responder advocacy as well as the annual Headache on the Hill to provide federal support for persons living with headache disorders and migraine disease. And he lives with debilitating cluster headache disease. And finally, Dr. Jason Seco is the national clinical lead at the VA Headache Disorder Centers of Excellence. After receiving his MD from Temple University School of Medicine, Dr. Seco completed his internship and residency at Yale New Haven Hospital. And Dr. Seco works closely with the American Academy of Neurology, including being actively involved in AAN committees, such as the Government Relations Committee. He also serves as the Director of Stroke Care for the VA Connecticut Health System. So welcome to you all, and I cannot imagine a better qualified panel to tackle this important issue. So John, let us start with you, because you have logged more than a few miles on Capitol Hill to do right by vets and first responders who have been exposed to toxins. Start us off by explaining what a burn pit is and what happens to vets and first responders who are exposed.
Well, one, thank you for having me. I'm humbled to sit on this panel with Joe and the doctor. It was great listening to Chairman Takano and my good friend John. We look forward to working with the chairman and getting legislation passed. And John and I and my team are going to do what we do best and help those who are suffering. But there's a lot to unpack with that question. You know, Ground Zero was a burn pit because everything was pulverized and crushed, fell down, and the fires burned for 99 days because of jet fuel. The burn pits in the Mideast and around the world that they use around the bases Same thing as ground zero. Same illnesses as 9/11 responders that veterans have, respiratory illnesses, cancers. But those pits, whether they were the size of a football field or the size of the front yard of your house, they burnt everything: food, waste, ammunition, human feces, body parts, clothing. And they started those fires with jet fuel. And John touched on that earlier. It's illegal in the United States. Now, I'm embarrassed because up until about 2 years ago, I didn't know about any of this. I might have heard stories about it, but when I found out about it, it raised my blood pressure a little more than it usually is. And these men and women who protect us 24/7 deserve better. They deserve better from our government, just like 9/11 responders. Our stories in the 9/11 community and the veteran community parallel each other. The illnesses parallel each other. And as for cluster headaches, 26% of 9/11 responders who were affected by the aftermath of 9/11 and its toxins suffer from cluster headaches. 22% in the veteran community affected by the burn pits suffer from cluster headaches. The numbers are starkly similar, and this is again falls on the lap of Congress. And no offense to Chairman Takano, who's a great man, but it's a body of work in D.C. that promises to fix yesterday's problem today, maybe tomorrow. That's unacceptable. We don't have to accept that anymore. We proved by going to D.C. for the last 16 years that we don't have to accept that anymore. D.C. does not work as fast as we do on Main Street in America. People are suffering, people are dying, and if we can afford to spend money to train these men and women to go to combat, to protect us and have the best interests of the United States around the world, then we should have the money to take care of them when they get back. You know, we're all guilty. Every one of us here today are guilty, and it's not malicious. It's not on purpose or done with ill intent, but we always say thank you for your service. Sometimes we say thank you for your service and your sacrifice. And that's the way we were raised. It's to respect those who served. But it falls short of addressing a serious issue. It should be, thank you for your service. Thank you for your sacrifice. What can I do to help you ease the pain that you have suffered, whether it's an IED or losing a body part or having a mental or a head injury or having cluster headaches or being burnt from the inside out from the toxic aftermath of the burn pits. We, the American people, we need to shed sunlight on this issue. You know, the Biden administration says they have 4 crises going on. The pandemic, the economy, equality. I don't know what the other one was because it wasn't one of my crises. But this needs to be added to the Biden administration, whose son, President Biden, whose son died of brain cancer, which we all know was linked to the burn pits. So John and I and others, we're going to get legislation passed that ensures these men and women get taken care of the rest of their lives.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for kind of some powerful insights on that and your passion. I think we can learn so much from you on this topic and how to effectively advocate on Capitol Hill, which we're all here to do. So we'll want to come back and ask some questions in a minute, but next I'd like to pivot to Joe. Joe, you have joined Headache on the Hill as a patient advocate for at least 4 years now, and you're also a first responder living with cluster headache. Tell us why it matters more people learn about the disability that migraine and cluster disease can create, and then how it affects our veterans and first responders in particular. What's been your experience?
Well, I'll start when my life was normal. I guess the last day of my life was normal was the morning of September 11th. I was off that day. I was helping to run a charity fundraiser for the fire department when we got word about what was going on in Lower Manhattan. And shortly after, we received orders to get gear and equipment and get to the World Trade Center. So we commandeered a bus and we made our way. When we arrived down there, we all know what it looks like. It was hell on earth for us. It was like an apocalyptic movie, and it didn't seem real. We got to work searching for survivors and putting out fires. And then a list of fire companies was put together, and my company, Engine 201, was on the list. And 4 of the 5 guys that were working that day are unaccounted for. Altogether, as we know, there were 343 firefighters. 26 of those firefighters I knew on a first-name basis. I knew them well. In the months following, we worked alongside volunteers, searching for the missing and tending to the families of those we lost. If we weren't working, we were attending as many funerals and memorials as we could. Some days there were as many as 8 a day. So needless to say, we were not in a good place. And at that time, I thought it couldn't get any worse. And about 6 months later, my first attack came. It hit me in the middle of the night. I woke up and felt as if I had just eaten a big bowl of ice cream. And I'm sure you could all remember as a kid when you ate ice cream too fast, that pain that you experienced. Well, that's how it starts. The pain behind my eye got worse over the next few minutes, and it felt like someone was stabbing me with a hot poker. I thought I was dying, thought I was having an aneurysm and that I was going to die. I ended up in the emergency room, and a few hours later, I left with a diagnosis of unspecified headache. The attacks continued after that. Sometimes I would get 2 or 3 a day, and I would literally bang my head against the wall and take my mind off the pain. The attacks lasted from 30 to 90 minutes, and after a few months and a few doctor's visits, I received a proper diagnosis. I'm very lucky that I received it that early. Cluster headache, otherwise known as suicide headache. I learned that you're 20 times more likely to end your life with this condition. I also learned that it's said to be one of the most painful conditions known to mankind. The attacks come in cycles. Some of the cycles last 6 weeks. Sometimes they last 6 months. And over the years, the attacks have came mostly at night. On a good night, I would get 1 attack. On a bad, 3. And at times, I fear going to sleep, knowing that the pain is coming. And it became difficult for me to work and function at home. I tried many medications over the years with little to no success, but a lot of side effects. And being desperate for help, I came across a website years ago called Cluster Busters, and finally I had a place to go for answers. I learned a lot, and I read about people using oxygen to abort cluster headache attacks. Well, lucky me, we had a ton of it in the firehouse. I tried it, and it worked. It worked great. Shortly after that, I became known as Oxygen Boy in the firehouse, but that's another story. Over time, I noticed certain things would trigger attacks. Changes in sleep patterns, smoke and dust, and stress were big ones for me. Years later, the attacks became more frequent, and the methods I used to abort them became less effective. I'd been seeing an ear, nose, and throat doctor for a while, and he said that my attacks were most likely being exacerbated by swelling in my sinuses and a contact point. He said that surgery might help. But I put the surgery off as long as I could, knowing full well that if I did get the surgery, there was a highly likely chance that the doctors would not put me back to full duty. But I couldn't live with the pain any longer. So in 2010, I decided to get the surgery. And about a year or so later, I had to say goodbye to the FDNY, the job I absolutely loved. Over the next few years, the number of guys I knew that developed cancer from 9/11 toxins continued to grow. Young guys in their 30s, healthy, including my younger brother, Dan, who was also a firefighter. Dan is alive today because of a medical monitoring program that was funded by the 9/11 bill. I watched reports in the news about the fight to extend that same bill, and I heard there was a rally going on at Ground Zero, so I decided to go. There I met John Field and others, and I followed them down to DC the next week. And after a morning press conference, I was handed a list of congressional offices to visit. And at that moment, I was a little nervous and unsure what to do. And I'm sure a lot of my Headache on the Hill advocates could relate. Their first congressional meeting was very nerve-wracking. And for a moment, I felt like I Forrest Gumped myself to Washington, D.C. But the small group I was paired up with did great. And in the end, after many years and a lot of hard work by the Feel Good Foundation and countless others, it got done. Thank God it did, because that bill's saving lives today. In 2017, I attended my first cluster headache conference. I met Bob Wold, the patron saint of cluster headaches, and Dr. Bob Shapiro, who have been fighting for people with headache disorders for years in Washington. These guys took the bull by the horns, and they were fighting for a cause, and I admire them all for that. The trip to the conference was life-changing for me. I met so many others that truly understand what it's like to live with debilitating cluster headaches. And over the years, I've heard nightmare stories from people being misdiagnosed and denied care. Captain Leroy Torres, an Army veteran who developed cluster headaches after his burn pit exposure, went 10 years without a proper diagnosis. 10 years he traveled around the country looking for answers and relief from the excruciating pain of cluster headache. I've heard stories from others looking for relief, others that have had surgery to have their trigeminal nerve removed from their head, leaving them with facial paralysis, others with deep brain stimulation implants inserted that did more harm than good, and even someone being prescribed medications that eventually led them to having a heart transplant. But one of the things that bothers me the most to this day was hearing that Medicare and other insurance companies kept denying oxygen coverage for cluster headache. Advocates have presented evidence that oxygen works and that it's safe for over 10 years now. Last year, advocates were told, and I quote, by Medicare, well, they could just go to the emergency room to get the oxygen. Really? Medicare expects, I mean, I've had days where I've had 6 attacks. Does Medicare expect me to drive to the hospital, to the ER 6 times a day with an ice pick sticking out of my eye? It just doesn't make sense. Tens of thousands of dollars could be spent in emergency room visits and even more on prescription drugs, but Medicare won't cover a few $100s worth of oxygen. That needs to change. It's hard enough to live with the stress of cluster headache, chronic migraine, or any other severe headache disorder. But if you're a veteran or a 9/11 first responder like myself dealing with PTSD, it really pushes you to the edge. We don't need the extra burden of having to travel great distances to get a correct diagnosis or specialty care. And to my fellow advocates out there, you know stories like these. You've experienced them yourselves. It's what drives us all to fight for change and to help others. And I love you all for that. You're all awesome. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Joe. It is unacceptable, the treatment that people with migraine and headache disorders like cluster experience, and the lack of access to some of the treatments we need, like oxygen. So I really appreciate your years of advocacy, and I also appreciate you clarifying that disability is not just a physical disability, but a financial disability that people experience when this happens.
Absolutely.
So thank you. So let me pivot now to Dr. Jason Seco. Dr. Seco, you are the leading medical expert on how veterans are affected by headache diseases. And we're so excited that you're going to be sharing some news-making scientific data with us today that'll help show the urgency of the crisis that John and Joe talked about. Dr. Seco?
Well, thank you again for the chance to be part of this panel, and I am deeply honored to be on a panel with heroes like John and Joe. I never had the chance to serve in the military. I tried, but because of my own medical conditions, I didn't get in. I come from a family of several veterans, my grandpas, my uncles. I have family members that are in the active military now, and the way that I serve them and help them is by being in the Veterans Health Administration. So I think, as many people know, the VA is the largest integrated healthcare system in the United States. The VA has more than 9 million veteran enrollees, and we see patients across over 1,000 outpatient clinics and 170 medical centers. So one of the things that keeps me up at night is linked to one of the charges that I have. So at the National Lead for the Headache Centers, I want to learn as much as we can about headache among our veterans, including toxic exposures and other military exposures. More importantly, and to Joe's point, I really want to help. So how can we take that knowledge and how could we improve headache care? So through work that we've done at the Headache Centers of Excellence Research and Evaluation Center, we're really learning a tremendous amount about headache among veterans. And by partnering with the team in the Burn Pit Registry, we're going to start learning more about burn pit exposure, veterans, and headache. Next slide, please. So some of the work that we've done has included creating what I've been told is the world's largest data set of patients with headache disorders. Next slide, please. So between fiscal year 2007 and September 2020, the VA has been caring for more than 1.6 million veterans with at least one headache disorder. Next slide, please. So what that means is about 14% of all veterans getting care in the VA have at least one headache disorder. And as impressive as these data are, one of the things that happens very frequently is that a veteran will be referred to me for a headache, may have headache listed in their chart, and these data are based on the administrative data. So unless someone is coded with a headache disorder, so someone has to be coded with a headache disorder for us to know about them. So oftentimes people will come to see me and never have a code for a headache disorder. I bring that up because despite as impressive as these numbers are, this is really is an under ascertainment of the number of veterans getting care in the VA that have headache disorders. Next slide, please. So, and when we see veterans in our clinic, we think about the headache, but we also want to look at that person as a person, look at them holistically. And oftentimes that means how can we improve? How could we help their overall health care? How could we help them as a person? And that often means that we have to address other health concerns that may influence or impact the headache disorder. So we know that almost half of all veterans with a headache disorder have at least one mental health condition. So we just heard in terms of how PTSD could worsen headache and make headache care more complicated. These are important considerations when caring for our veterans with headache. Next slide, please. Almost 2/3 of veterans with headache have at least one other painful non-headache condition. Sometimes this is chronic neck pain that they've gotten from a whiplash injury that they've also sustained while having a traumatic brain injury. Sometimes this is chronic lower back pain. Sometimes this is limb pain or nerve pain. These are important considerations as we treat patients with headache disorders. Next slide, please. So in the VA, saw these veterans across 9.7 million appointments during the time frame that we talked about. So through this work, we're really understanding that there are millions of veterans with headache, and that the VA is seeing millions of these veterans and trying to deliver the best care possible. Next slide, please. So in considering veterans with migraine that get care in the VA, about 8% will see a neurologist or another headache specialist. Next slide. Compared with this, the community settings where the number is about 4%. So while the VA is doing a nice job in part to see for veterans with migraine to see a neurologist or other headache specialist, there's definitely work to be done. Next slide, please. So as impressive as the 1.6+ million veteran number are, when I'm in clinic, when my colleagues and friends are in clinic, serving and helping veterans, it's not necessarily about the 1.6 million veterans, it's about that one person. Because that one person has a life, that one person has a family, they have friends, they have interests, they have a story. So in the words of some of the veterans that we've been interviewing, and we've been interviewing dozens and dozens of veterans to understand their journey as they've gotten headache care through the DoD, through the VA, and then eventually through the headache centers. So these are some quotes from veterans that have gotten care within our headache centers. And it's really gratifying to see that we've helped so many. So people have told us that we've been a godsend and that everybody needs headache specialists like this in their lives if they have chronic headache disorders. Next slide, please. And that they wish that they had been getting this type of treatment, not just today, not just yesterday, but the years that they've been living with headache and migraine disorders. Next. And really oftentimes, it takes a little bit to get to warm up and get to know your healthcare provider. But when patients do, oftentimes good things happen. Next slide, please. So we've been hearing a tremendous amount about 9/11 first responders and debris cloud exposure. So in looking at some of these numbers, we're seeing the percentage of adult ground zero survivors reporting severe headache, not just immediately, but years later, with the understanding or the idea that that exposure at one time could lead to problems down the road. So understanding sort of what that natural history is. So we see that more than 26% of 9/11 first responders get severe headaches compared to those that were not exposed to a dust cloud. Next slide, please. So, and in looking at some of the data from the Open Burn Pit registry, again, these are veterans that have donated their time to participate in the registry. And we see that compared to veterans that have, on the far right of the slide, 12.4%, where veterans that have not had any burn pit exposure reporting migraine headache that impact their activities of daily living. Those that were both exposed and had burn pit as part of their duties, 22.2% of veterans are reporting these types of headache. As you can tell, we've learned a lot, but there's a lot more that we still need to learn to better help our veterans with headache disorders. Next slide, please.
For going through that data with us. It's really valuable for us to understand the connection between burn pits and the incidence of migraine and headache disorders. And it certainly appears that there's some early data there that's leaning that direction. So we hope that we'll learn more in the time ahead. So we've heard 2 riveting patient stories, and now we have some new data. So it's time for questions for our panel, and then we're going to take some from the audience. So anyone watching, I encourage you to please type them into the chat box, and we're going to try to get to as many questions as possible. But first, I want to go back to something that Joe said about cluster headache patients are 20 times more likely to commit suicide. Joe, talk to us about what it means when patients experience challenges with access to care. What happens?
Well, I think I touched on it a little bit before, but I mean, I would say if someone could actually see, it's an invisible disease. It's not like, Lou Gehrig's disease or cerebral palsy or what have you. But if people could actually see, I believe they would have a better understanding. In the case of cluster headache, it feels as if you have an ice pick in your eye. Migraine, it's like a vice on your head, squeezing all day. If you walk the streets all day with an ice pick on your eye, hanging out of your eye, or a vice, people would say, geez, wow, but the problem is that people can't see your pain, and it's very difficult for people to understand what you're going through and how it affects. I mean, in my case in particular, what like I said before, I mean, there are nights when I get 3 attacks. I'm up all night. I can't sleep, and it's day after day. I mean, I've had periods where I had 3 or 4 attacks a night for 3 weeks where I couldn't sleep, and I learned about what sleep deprivation does to you. I think an understanding of what it really feels like and how you can't function, as a first responder. It's not like you have to throw the garbage out or anything, or even a mother of 3, she has to take care of her kids. She doesn't have time to go lay down or take care of herself. She has to take care of the kids. And veterans, I mean, do you stop in the middle of a war and say, geez, I can't fight, guys. Sorry, I have a headache. It's just, I wish more people would understand about that.
Right. And if they don't have access to the medication that's needed or the treatment that's needed, like oxygen, does the disease absolutely. In your experience chronify or get worse?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I know for a fact, with cluster headaches, and I believe so especially with migraine, if you don't seek out medical treatment early, you're already behind the 8 ball, and there's a good chance that you'll go chronic. And that's one of the worst fears of my life, because I do get periods of remission. But I don't know if I can handle every day, being stabbed in the eye 3 times a day. I can't, I don't know what I would do, to be honest with you.
Right.
If I would recommend get treatment early and avoid becoming chronic. It would really, really make it. I mean, I'm glad I saw it out early, and I'm able to function today because I sought, the medical attention early.
Yeah, and the implications could be that for 14% of the population that's serving and protecting us, they're not able to do so. I interviewed a police officer, woman, at one time, who talked about how she couldn't function because she couldn't get her medication and she couldn't function on the job, and she had to retire to a desk job, for example. So I can see how that would occur. So, John, as we were prepping for this panel, you talked about, and earlier in your comments, you talked about how it's not enough to say thank you for your service. Tell us why we should be asking people, what can I do for you instead?
Yeah, Paul, this is frustrating because I try to make things simple that I can understand it. And then when I open my mouth and I'm privileged to speak to the masses, I want them to understand it. No first responder, no veteran, no active military should have to beg for help. If you strip somebody of their entity, strip them of their rank, strip them of their title, and strip them of their clothes, they'd be very fast to help us. But when you give them a rank, you make them part of an entity that always fights us, then it's hard to get these men and women help. So while we're trying to get legislation passed, whether it's in the 9/11 community or now in the veteran community, more importantly, we're trying to change the environment and the culture on how these men and women are going to be treated when they come back. This is a really easy fix if they want to do it. It's that simple. I want to help you. Done. Congress, pass legislation, VA, honor that piece of legislation so that these men and women get taken care of. I see so many men and women in the 9/11 community and the veteran community who complain of these headaches and are afraid to talk about these headaches. And it's the new post-traumatic, because years ago, nobody would want to talk about their PTSD. And I suffer from post-traumatic. I was diagnosed by 4 doctors with it. But it was a stigma and it was embarrassing. And how could I, with all of these tattoos and muscles, have post-traumatic? I'm supposed to be strong. Not the case. I need somebody to talk to all the time. These headaches or any illnesses affected by the burn that were contributed to the burn pits, post-traumatic, is not a stigma. It means you've been through something and you came out the other end and you survived. But it's up to those who have the ability to help ensure that you have some sort of quality of life. They're coming home and hailed as heroes, given a parade, given a medal on their chest, and then thrown out to the garbage because they're a drain financially on the system. We have to do better than that. What is wrong with us that we can't figure this out?
Yeah, I think John Stewart said it very well. It's a moral imperative.
Well,
what is wrong with us?
Whatever John Stewart says, he copies me, right? So,
of course.
Yeah, I'm his life coach and his guru. But let me tell you something about John Stewart. John nor I have any skin in this game other than we care. We're not getting anything out of it. No one's paying us. No one's gonna give us anything for it. And hopefully we get this done so we can appreciate that people are going to be helped. And there is no better gift or no better feeling of knowing that we help people that can't repay us, because in essence, we're paying them back from keeping us safe from harm's way 24/7 for the last 244 years.
Yeah, well, thank you for pointing that out about Jon Stewart. That 9 times out of 10, when a celebrity shows up for something, they're doing it for the publicity value or because they're being paid, and he's not being paid. So we really appreciate his engagement on this really important issue. So I'm going to want some more coaching, sincere life coaching, about how to effectively engage with veterans in a way that is truly helpful. But we're going to talk about that a little bit more. Next question is for Dr. Seco. You know, Dr. Seco, very often we hear about how healthcare for vets and first responders focuses primarily on those scary diseases like cancer or respiratory illnesses. And these are critically important, but explain how sometimes headache and migraine can be a sign of something else, as well as their own disabling diseases, the difference.
Yeah, absolutely, Paul. So I very much agree. So when it comes to respiratory illnesses and cancer, they're scary and important diseases. And in many ways, headache and migraine are scary, important diseases, perhaps in different ways. So sometimes headache could be associated with other things. So in the veteran community, we see a lot of headache that comes from that's been associated with traumatic brain injury, or otherwise known as post-traumatic headache. Sometimes headache could be from overuse of medications. More and more, we're seeing that headache is occurring after exposure to burn pit. So even now, if you look at data from the National Burn Pit Registry, headache is the 5th most common concern that veterans are reporting in this registry. Some of the other things that I see pretty regularly in the stories that veterans share with me in clinic is, as was mentioned, when you're in the middle of the war, either you may be having headache and you just can't tap out, or maybe you're not having headache. But one of the common things I also hear is that after someone returns to stateside, they start developing headache. And so there's something that's well known in the headache and migraine literature in terms of the stress letdown response, where people have a busy week, running here, running there, work weeks, kids, school, etc., and the stress hormones are higher. The cortisol levels are higher during the week. And then come the weekend, when things may be less busy, those stress hormones decrease and could bring about headache. And that's called a stress letdown response. So I can't imagine a bigger stress letdown response when active military have been in the campaign. They're risking their life every minute, every hour, every day for months on end, and then they come home stateside. And so I see that pretty often as well. But also to Joe's point, if people are having headache, there's tremendous strength in talking to providers about it and saying, yes, I have this and it's concerning, and to get help. There's tremendous strength in getting help for headache disorders.
Yeah, I think that stress letdown is something that almost everybody listening can relate to, because you push through to the weekend, and then I'm sure it's the same thing for people who are serving. You push through either to the end of your shift if you're a first responder, or you push through to the end of your deployment if you are deployed in the military. So do you want to talk anything more about the National Burn Pit Registry and why that matters?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as we mentioned, the National Burn Pit Registry is an amazing avenue by which we could understand the impact that burn pit exposure has on our veterans. And yes, in terms of respiratory disorders and asthma and that sort of thing, but also in terms of headache. So over the last few years, if we were having this conversation a couple of years ago, headache was the 6th most common concern that veterans expressed in the burn pit registry. And by veterans enrolling burn pit registry, they could do a couple of things. They could help to lend itself to our understanding about burn pit exposure and headache and burn pit exposure and other illnesses. It's also a way by which that information that the burn pit registry learns about you could be conveyed to your primary care providers or other healthcare providers as well. In many ways, it's also a way that not only could you be helpful to yourself, but also be helpful to your fellow veterans. And also, as John had mentioned, there in terms of the 9/11 first responders, as well as active military personnel that are exposed to burn pit, such commonalities. And the thing that we learned from the VA burn pit registry could be translated outside the veteran population.
So not only are they going to get care, but they're also going to help others kind of pay it forward by sharing some of their experience, so we have data to better understand the
Well,
problem, right?
can I add something to that
Absolutely.
really quick?
Yeah.
So the doctor is 100% right with the burn pit registry. And while it's mostly effective, and not only does it collect data that will help doctors and scientists find new illnesses and find commonalities between the 9/11 community, it will help us pass legislation. So more people that come forward and join the registry and document their illnesses, it helps get legislation passed. It helps get illnesses covered. And after 9/11 in 2002, the 9/11 Health Registry was created. And while it's just a registry, it's not going to treat you. It's not going to compensate you. It's not going to give you health care. It does help down the road when legislation or illnesses are being added. And that's what's important about the registry.
John, I don't just want you to be my life coach. I want you to be my advocacy coach. So that's a really good point. Data matters. And the more data we get, the better we can fight on Capitol Hill. So thanks for bringing that up. And coming back to you for a minute, there's a real hesitancy, as you said, for many people to seek help. How do we help build the confidence for people in the military as well as first responders to come and get the help that they need?
Care, listen, be their friend. Don't be the doctor, don't be the lawyer, don't be the staff sergeant, don't be the corporal, don't be the colonel. Be their friend. You know, Joe will tell you in the 9/11 community, we have a bitter taste in our mouth with a lot of people in Congress and the Senate or at the World Trade Center Health Program or the Victims Compensation Fund. You know, these men and women, and I say these men and women, I'm one of them, and even in the veteran community, they have been through the mill. They have been lied to. They have been denied. They have been kicked while they're down. They want a friend. And again, it goes back to strip somebody of the entity they work for and their rank and their clothes, and they will help you because they're humbled, just like the person asking for help. And if we all just stop, put aside our differences, put aside our politics and our religions and anything else that separates us, we'll realize that we have more in common than when we don't. And it's really easy to help somebody when you want to. It's that simple. Be their friend and listen and understand what they're going through. Everybody has a story, and none of them are the same. And the VA, the DOD, our federal government, Congress, the Senate, Santa Claus, the Easter Bunny has to do a better job in helping these men and women come back and have some sort of productive life after serving their country.
Amen to that. Yeah. So thank you. Joe, I want to ask you about this reentry point, the civilian life reentry, and specifically how that affects work and family, you know, some ways that employers and loved ones can support vets, and particularly those who have invisible wounds and invisible illnesses.
Yeah, well, like I had said before, it was difficult for me because I had to retire early. Leaving the fire department life was a huge transition for me, and I'm still. I mean, I still wanted to contribute. I still wanted to do good things, and I think that's part of the reason what drove me to advocacy. But again, like I said before, I think more people just need to understand what it's like living with the headaches. When I was never a veteran, so I really can't speak on veterans affairs. But in general, when you're desperate and you need help, and you're dealing with this pain day in and day out, you don't need roadblocks. You need people, you know, to listen to you and to help you along the way, to guide you. I was lucky. I mean, in the fire department, you know, we get pretty tight, and they have groups. You know, we still talk to the guys in the firehouse from time to time, and it's like a support group. And I'm sure, I'm positive, there's plenty of military groups out there like that. But I think that's where the rubber meets the road with transitioning back into civilian life. I mean, you still need a little bit of that connection, and you still need the feeling as if you're contributing and doing something. I would say that's the best way to answer that question.
Yeah, give people a reason to get out of bed in the morning and something purposeful to do in life. It's very well said.
Absolutely.
So, Dr. Siegel, you said that there are two things that keep you up at night. Your 3-year-old, some people can relate to that, and whether or not you are able to help a veteran. So talk to us about how the Burn Pits Registry is currently utilized and how adding registrations into the registry will help veterans to get better care.
Yep, absolutely. Thanks for that, Paula. And even last night, my 3-year-old did the same thing. So she's absolutely consistent. Before talking a bit more about the permit, I just wanted to add a bit to what John and Joe have been saying, where everybody's story is so important, and you have to believe that. And even if you've asked for help before and you weren't satisfied with the help that you got, ask again or ask someone else. I can't tell you how often people come into my clinic and they've been told that there's nothing that can be done for the headache disorder, that nothing can be done for the migraine, that nothing could be done for the cluster headache. Within our Headache Centers of Excellence administrative data set, there's 27,000 veterans that have cluster headache. There's more than 500,000 veterans with migraine headache. If you need help and you're not getting the best answer, ask someone else. But there's lots of great therapies out there. And unfortunately, sometimes it takes a little while to get to those right therapies. So just had wanted to add that, Paula. But then also in terms of the other thing that keep me up at night, exactly that, in terms of, you know, how can we provide the best care possible to veterans, because they absolutely deserve it. They deserve it day in and day out. And some of the things that we're learning from the Burn Pit Registry are important in that effect. So even just thinking broadly about the Burn Pit Registry, we know that 1 out of 3 veterans report a definitive or probable exposure to environmental hazards. And 1 out of 4 report some kind of persistent major health concern due to these deployment exposures. And again, there's still so much that we need to know and learn about burn pit exposure and headache. But then also, one of the things that, as more and more veterans that I've been seeing share with me that they've been exposed to burn pit, one of the common questions I have is, well, how can you help me now? Which is hugely important. What will my headaches be like a year from now, 3 years from now, 5 years from now? And those longer term questions, I don't have the answer to. I really don't. And through this registry, that's one way of getting those answers.
Excellent. Yeah, well, one of the things that we learned from the data that you shared is that 14% of the veterans have some headache disorder going on, headache or migraine, which is the same level of incidence, roughly getting close to, as women in the population. So 1 in 5, math's a little off, but approximately 1 in 5 veterans and approximately 1 in 5 or 6 women have migraine, for example. And that kind of blew me away, because no one's talking about it. So I throw this out for any of the speakers. Do you think that the headache and migraine stigma is even more pervasive in the military and the first responder communities?
Well, I mean, I could speak for first responders. You don't, you're a big, tough fireman, and you don't want to admit that, that you're in pain. Like I said before, I became oxygen boy in a firehouse because I would be, it wouldn't be uncommon to see me sitting on the back step of the engine at 3:30 in the morning sucking some oxygen. But yeah, it was a little difficult. Sometimes I went to a place in the firehouse to hide. I didn't want guys to see me suffering like that. When I get an attack, I don't even like my family seeing me. I kind of hide away. But yeah.
Paul, everybody at ground zero, I can block out what I saw at ground zero, the devastation, the carnage, the destruction. But what I'm going to remember are grown men, burly, macho men with tattoos on their neck and mustaches the size of poodles, crying and hugging each other, strangers. We have this macho bravado about us that, hey, listen, I was in the Army. I wrestled for 17 years. I am badass, but I also suffer from post-traumatic. I cry. It's okay. It's all right to come forward and tell your story. But we've created a system that doesn't make us feel comfortable in doing it. What we need to do, Paula, are train people to throw the bucket of water. And what I mean by that, if Joe or the doctor or you saw somebody running down the street on fire and there was a bucket of water right there, I'm hoping your first reaction is to throw that water on them. But we have too many people in place that refuse to pick up that bucket of water because they were told not to throw it, or they're not strong enough to throw it. But until we get people to learn how to throw that bucket of water, so many people are going to suffer because they're on fire with headaches, cancers, respiratory illnesses, and post-traumatic, and they're slowly dying because nobody threw that bucket of water.
Yeah, well said. I think it is invisible, and I appreciate the question from the audience on this. We all need to be paying closer attention and then getting that bucket of water out. So we've got a few more questions from the audience that I want to get in. Dr. Seco, tell us, what are the clinical features described by burn pit victims? We heard the phrase sort of burning from the inside. What's typical of cluster and of migraine?
Yeah, so some of the things that's been my experience is so typically when we think about headache disorders, we think about, as a headache neurologist, I think about the International Classification of Headache Disorders. And so meaning that there's criteria for every type of headache out there, that at least we think there is. And this is a way by which there's a shared language we could understand, and we could really say, okay, well, we think this person has migraine or probable migraine, this person has cluster headache. And it helps us to communicate. But what happens is that sometimes new things happen. And so when I see someone that has had headache after burn pit exposure, they don't fit neatly into any of these buckets. So in terms of the timing, so sometimes I have two patients that look like they have cluster headache, but the timing is off. And it's also and then also, so sometimes as physicians, we call them atypical features, but really they don't fit into sort of a nice discrete bucket that was taught in our headache medicine fellowships and practices to define people with this type of headache. So sometimes then those patients get diagnosed with headaches not otherwise specified. And Joe, you mentioned that also, where that type of diagnosis could delay care because maybe we just don't know how to treat it, or we minimize it. So I have some patients that look like they have cluster headache. I have one that looks like they have hemicranic continuum, but doesn't fit all those criteria. I have a couple that look like they have migraine, but it lasts longer. It's less responsive to therapy. And I think that's also one of the differences that I've noticed is that the therapies that we try to use, so meaning if it looks like migraine, we treat with migraine-specific medication, they seem not to work as well, has been my experience. So not only do they sort of not fit into this neat bucket that we're so used to thinking about, but also they're less responsive to some of the conventional therapies that we have to offer.
Yeah, interesting. So a question again for any of you guys. This whole issue of burn pits and burn pit registries is news to many of us who are kind of stepping into this world right now. So I'm wondering, is there the opportunity for the VA to designate funding for a national outreach or awareness campaign, or even tracking mortality in the burn pit registry?
Yes. I mean, the VA has a responsibility, the DOD has a responsibility, Congress has a responsibility. And this goes back to what everything I said earlier. Let me just take one step back. There's no draft. Everybody who joins the military, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, Coast Guard, is voluntary. Nobody joins the military or the fire department for Joe. Nobody joins and says, I'm going to get cancer, I'm going to get cluster headaches, and I'm going to pull off the world's biggest fraud because I want to make myself miserable the rest of my life. These men and women are generally and sadly sick with these headaches and these other illnesses. There's no fraud. And it's up to the VA and the DOD and Congress and the Senate to do the right thing. But it's also up to us as advocates to shed sunlight on this issue, to take to social media, to take to the 24-hour news cycle when they're not consumed and beat up one story for 4 days in a row. We need to break through. The American people need to know that there's about 3% of us that served our country proudly, and they need our help. And if we can't do that one little thing, then we failed not only as a country, but as human beings.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and again,
no doubt.
I just wanted to add one thing. I mean, we talked about it before. I mean, the biggest thing to get information and to get get help and learn about chronic migraine or cluster headache or any other diseases that you might come from burn pit exposures is to get people signed on, like, get people on the registry, like you said. But things like this and, having Jon Stewart, promoted as well is definitely going to help more people become aware, because nothing gets done. No answers, no questions get answered about headache diseases or cancer or any of these other illnesses that people are experiencing from burn pit exposures, unless people step up and sign up and provide their story. And that's how, researchers like Dr. Seco and what have you, that's how things get done. It doesn't happen magically. People need to step up and speak out and get on these lists.
Yeah. And Joe,
Fantastic.
maybe to add to that also, oh, excuse me, Paula, is that, yes, we've talked about headache and respiratory problems and cancer, but you may have been exposed to a burn pit, or you may have been served our country proudly during that time and not have any of those problems. But again, we know very little about the natural history of burn pit exposure and things like headache, things like cancer, things like pulmonary or lung problems. So even if you're not experiencing any of these concerns, but if you check out the link that we'll put in the chat, if you're interested, please sort of check it out and sign up. Again, you don't have to have any of these concerns whatsoever right now. And none of us hope that you develop any problems in the future, but this could be another means by which we could understand the associations between burn pit exposure and other health conditions, and specifically headache and chronic migraine.
Very well said, Dr. Seco. Thank you. And I just want to wrap up the panel and thank you guys so much. You've been incredible. And I can tell how much you fiercely love our country and fiercely love the women and men who have served our country and who serve us as first responders. So thank you.
Paul, I think, one thing, it's not love for country. It's love for humanity and empathy. And I think that trumps the country. Anybody can do what Joe's doing or I'm doing or the doctor's doing. For the doctor, you got to go to college. But for us, anybody can be an advocate. And if you care, then get involved. We'll accept you into our circle.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Joe. And thank you, Dr. Seco. And now I'd like to ask Dr. Robert Shapiro, the professor of neurological sciences at the University of Vermont and the founder of Headache on the Hill, to focus us on today's work. Headache on the Hill has been his passion for almost 15 years now. Dr. Shapiro, can you please walk us through what the advocates are focused on this year and how it will address the important issues that our panel discussed today?
Thanks very much, Paula, and a huge thank you to Chairman Takano, Jon Stewart, John Field, Joe McKay, Jason Seco for leading in this area. It's not just service. Apologies to John Field for thanking you for service, but it's really for leadership on a critical area that really gets insufficient attention. And thank you all. Thank you for being here. So this is a huge problem. It's a huge problem which has gained almost no attention. It's flown under the radar, and it's gained little attention because most people think that headache is an inconsequential problem. And compared to cancer or other issues, it's seen as lesser worthy of attention. But the disabling qualities of the experiences that our veterans have been experiencing, and 9/11 first responders have been experiencing as a consequence of their experiences deployed at 9/11 and deployed in Iraq and Afghanistan, have been durable, long-lasting, and utterly disabling. So maybe I could have the first slide, please. So we've been working for, as Paula mentioned, about 15 years to try to gain equity for people who have been harmed by headache disorders or are living with headache disorders. And in particular, this impacts our veterans. And in fiscal year 2018, we were fortunate to gain appropriations to establish at least 5 headache disorder centers of excellence within the VA system. And Dr. Seco leads this program. Currently, it's expanded due to success to 14 sites across the country, 7 hub sites and 7 consortium sites. And I'll explain in a moment why that's insufficient, although we're fortunate that we have those sites right now. And the roles of the headache centers of excellence are multiple. The first is to actually take care of the veterans who seek care. And these come from lots of different quarters. There's been appropriate attention today to the burn pit issue, but the scale of it I don't think is well appreciated. So the estimate currently is that there were 3 million veterans, 3 million service personnel who were exposed in theater in Iraq and Afghanistan to these open toxic burn pits. And the consequences, whatever the health consequences that have occurred due to their service, has to be seen in the context that this is another important exposure that they had, which has adverse consequences. It's also notable that what is sometimes referred to as the signature injury of these conflicts, the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts, is traumatic brain injury. And traumatic brain injury for these service personnel is really layered on top of the burn pit exposure. And the estimate now is that at least 350,000 service personnel were exposed to traumatic brain injury or concussive injury. And a pivotal study looked at a cohort of these service personnel some 4 to 11 years later. And approximately half of them were describing headache at least 15 or more days per month. 90% of those met the clinical criteria to meet the diagnosis of migraine. Now, to put this in context, young, healthy individuals who have disabling conditions aren't usually the same group. So those service personnel who volunteered, as John Field mentioned, to enter into service were less likely to have disabling medical conditions like chronic migraine. And in particular, it's also true that this is far less prevalent among men than women. So if you think about what the likelihood of having chronic migraine was prior to joining the military, it was certainly less than 10%, perhaps less than 5% of that cohort before they joined. After their exposure, half of them had a chronic migraine or something that we regard as similar to chronic migraine. And it's understood that migraine is the second leading cause of US and global disability. This is a huge issue. So these individuals really are experiencing a disabling condition. And these headache centers are critical to provide care for these particular individuals. But it's also noted, and this is the second point about where the headache centers provide service, they also provide key education and training for other healthcare providers, doctors, nurses, and so on within the VA system. And this is a recognition that these disorders are very prevalent. This means that the first steps in treating, in managing these disorders really should fall on primary care. every primary care doctor knows how to treat high blood pressure or asthma or diabetes. They really should know how to do the first steps in terms of treating these disorders. And that's the education piece of these headache centers. That's what is a critical area of service for these centers. And the third major piece is research. And there's been a lot of discussion here about the burn pit registries, which provide great data to try to reinforce and understand the preliminary data that Dr. Seco presented, showing that there really is a presumption that these exposures, these burn pit exposures, increase the likelihood of leading to disabling headache disorders. But we need far, far more research to be able to understand this. What exposures were most important? What sort of treatments may be most effective and helpful? And we don't have that research. And these centers will be an important laboratory to provide understanding about these disorders and to hopefully come up with new ways to treat them, which would benefit not just veterans, but also the civilian population. But it's also key to understand that research can't just happen within the VA. And that's why we're also working this year in particular, and I'll come to this momentarily, to increase significantly the NIH commitment to understand these disorders, which are the most burdensome diseases which receive the least NIH funding for research. So we need to actually make changes, not just in terms of expansion of access within the VA for these programs and services, but we also need a commitment from the NIH to do their part to promote programs which increase the research. So next slide, please. So how many veterans in the VA system actually are seeking care for this? Now, Dr. Seco mentioned that it's about 9 million veterans who are in the system, which is only about half of all the veterans that have returned from service. So currently in 2020, over 408,000 veterans sought this specialty care within the VA system. But the current headache disorder centers of excellence only provide access to care for about half of them. And this is based upon an understanding now, which is really due to research that Dr. Seco and others in these centers have been able to perform since they were founded, that we understand that the veterans who are seeking care are not randomly distributed across the country. It's not a homogeneous problem across every jurisdiction. So we need to make sure that the centers are located as close as we can to those veterans who seek and deserve to receive this specialty care. So this is really an issue about equitable access. It's about making sure that every veteran who needs this care can be provided this care. So next slide, please. So our ask, or one of our two principal asks for Headache on the Hill this year, is to have appropriate reappropriations for the VA Headache Centers of Excellence system to allow expansion of this system from 14 sites to 28 sites nationally to make sure that every veteran has this within reach. This is a critical and should not be a controversial issue to request of members of Congress. We are urging every member of Congress to actually be a champion for this issue. This is really so much an obvious thing that we should be doing for our service personnel who have actually given us so much. Next slide, please. And part of that, once again, is this burn pit registry. If we don't have enough information, as John Field mentioned, we have a harder time understanding what's going on. We have a harder time making progress at understanding how to combat it and provide relief for these disorders. And we actually have a harder time advocating before members of Congress without the weight of evidence. So 3 million veterans were exposed during the Iraq and Afghanistan conflicts to these open burn pits. About 230,000 have so far registered. That's great, but it's only about 8% of all of those veterans who might come forward. And we urge all veterans who may have been exposed or who were actually there but weren't exposed, because we need them to come forward as well. So we have a comparator group to sign up for the burn pit registry. It's a really critical way that you can continue to serve, so we can understand these issues. So we urge you to do it. There's a website that's listed there. So please, please help and join in this effort. Next slide, please. And then finally, today, we have our Headache on the Hill Advocacy Day, which is happening virtually by Zoom. We're going to be meeting with somewhere close to 270 congressional offices. And we have our own small army with a small A army of advocates that are meeting with congressmen, senators, and their staff to urge them to support the appropriations to ensure that these VA headache centers of excellence are fully funded, that we're able to provide these services. And you can do your part. Even if you're not seeing members of Congress or their staff today directly, you can send a specific message in support of this effort by going to the website that you see up on the screen right now. This is really a way that anybody and everybody can participate. And further, if you respond to this, then we will be able to contact you again so that you can send another message in the coming days, urging our members of Congress also to increase the NIH funding for research. It's one thing to be able to provide great care, but it's another thing to be able to provide the best care we can because we understand these diseases better and we understand what is going to make the most difference to be able to provide relief. And we cannot do that without research. The research has to come from these VA headache centers. It also needs to come from NIH. It's not one or the other. It's absolutely necessary that we have both. So thank you so very much. And once again, thanks so much to Chairman Takano, to Jon Stewart. The most important and compelling messages from John Field and Joe McKay. And thanks again to Dr. Seco leading this effort within the VA. And also thanks Paula and Lindsay for helping to organize this.
Well, it's been my pleasure. Oh, animation. Well, it's been my pleasure. Thank you to moderate the panel, and thank you, Dr. Shapiro, and to ADA and HMPF for inviting me to do so. To wrap up, I'd like to ask Jon Stewart, who's been listening while we have been chatting away here. Jon, do you have any observations for us or any inspiration for the many advocates who are ready to go talk to their congressman on the Hill?
The biggest thing that I would say to everybody, and it's a hard lesson to learn, is it's a slog, as you know, and it takes an awful lot of effort and an awful lot of time. The one thing I would tell you not to do is negotiate against your own need. You know what the need is, you know what the urgency is. No one experiences it like y'all do. And so when you go to Congress, don't let them get away with what they can do. Make sure that they do what they must do. So do not negotiate against yourself. Have a clarity of the vision of what you know will solve the problem, and keep that in front of mind as you push for what it is. They're not aware. They're disjointed from the facts on the ground. So you have to educate them, but don't negotiate against yourself.
Thank you, Jon. I think I can speak for everyone who's been watching that, people are going to walk away changed by this panel, by these presentations. These stories are the type that sit with you. People should be rightly frustrated, sure, inspired, but also motivated, right? So, the good news is I can confidently say the migraine community, at least, is very organized, mobilized, and I consider them to be a force. So, whatever is next in terms of advocacy, we want to be supportive. But we very much appreciate you lending your time and your voice to this, because it's not just a needle moving exercise here. What you're doing will make a huge difference. So thank you for being here.
Thank you. And it's the people, it's the boots on the ground that get things done. And you all provide that. So thank you.
Thank you. So we're a little over time. I'm going to close out our program today just on behalf of the Headache and Migraine Policy Forum and the Alliance for Headache Disorders Advocacy. We truly want to thank Chairman Takano, our special guest speaker, Jon Stewart, our fabulous moderator, Paula Dumas, and our incredible panel. But most of all, we thank the audience for joining to our Headache on the Hill advocates. You have a whole lot of people supporting you. We thank you, and the fight to help vets and first responders continues. So thank you and have a wonderful rest of your day.